we are in a place where you turn on the news, and if it's not COVID, it's police reform. And so in that light, we have been honored to have as our guest today, and I'd like to introduce first is from the Black Shield Police Association, Sergeant Vincent Montague. Sergeant, thank you for joining us today. We greatly appreciate that. And also joining us is Roger Smith, who is the administrator of the Office of Professional Standards here in Cleveland. I thank both of you gentlemen for being here today. Clearly this is a time where we all need to be talking, and we all need to kind of figure out what the solutions are to repair and build the relationships between the police department, the community, and even the relationships within the police departments themselves. And so who better to have as guests than both of you gentlemen. For those of you who are watching, you can certainly send any questions that you have through the chat feature. And if last week was any sort of indication, you know that it will be difficult to get to even a fraction of the questions. But I will be seeing them. I will ask as many as I can, time permitting. And then also know that if I don't get to your questions, we are capturing all of them. We are putting them into a greater database for us to have answered and for future presentations. So please send as many in as you can, and we will get to them. So Sergeant, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you. If you can just introduce yourself, give us a little bit of your background, your current position.
My name is Vincent Montague, and I'm currently the president of the Black Shield Police Association. I do hold the rank of a sergeant within the Cleveland Division of Police. I've been an officer for 12 years, and I'm thank you for inviting me on, and hopefully I could share some insight from being the president of Black Shield and with my experience of being a police officer today.
That's great. We really do appreciate you coming on. I think, having officers, law enforcement on like you, it needs to be more widespread. And so this is a great start, and we're really happy that you came to do that with the CMBA. So thank you. So Sergeant, if you could tell us a little bit about Black Shield, and I'll just call it Black Shield just to go through it, when you were formed and what the purpose was.
The Black Shield Police Association was formed in 1946. It was formed as a shield club, and when it was formed, it was more so of a social club so that Black officers can have that camaraderie together on the job, because there were so few Black officers on the job. They weren't even able to speak to each other when they were on the job. In the 70s, it formed as an association, so it was established as the Black Shield Police Association. And during the period of time, they fought for equal rights for Black officers, and also stood up for the community as well, for issues that were going on. And we could talk about the Glenville riots, where the Black Shield was involved in, to fighting for minorities to get on the job. And they actually was involved with a lawsuit which created a consent decree to hire more Black officers. And they also fought for rights of women. Women were assigned to the detective bureau. They had to wear skirts. So the Black Shield was involved in that lawsuit, so women can also have rights and be equals as other officers on the job. So the Black Shield, we like to call ourselves the conscience of the community, but we strive for equality and fairness within a division of police and also within the community.
Okay, thank you. So last week, as you may know, we had on other speakers, and one of those speakers was a lawyer for the Cleveland Police Patrolmen's Association, which is a union. Are you affiliated with that? Are members of the Black Shield also part of that, or are they two separate and distinct groups?
Yes, how the Cleveland Division of Police is set up, the collective bargaining entities are the CPPA, the Cleveland Patrolmen's Association, which they represent patrol officers. And then you have the FOP, which represents officers that are sergeant, the rank of sergeant and above. So our members of the Black Shield, they're all members of the CPP or FOP because they deal with the collective bargaining.
Got it. Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Smith, thank you also again for being here. Like the sergeant, if you wouldn't mind kind of introducing yourself, background, and what your current position is.
Yes, my name is Roger Smith. I've been an attorney for approximately 21 years. I began as the administrator at the Office of Professional Standards in June of 2018. Prior to that, I had worked for close to 9 years as the Executive Agency Counsel and Director of Training at the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board.
Got it. Okay, so you came from New York. I'm sorry?
I was just saying I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Well, no, and we thank you also. I mean, invaluable discussion today. So if you could tell us about the office, what it is and so forth.
Sure. The Office of Professional Standards is the agency that investigates community public complaints of misconduct by members of the Cleveland Division of Police. We investigate non-criminal complaints. So it would be some allegations of force, use of force, also improper procedure, unprofessional conduct, lack of service, and harassment. Those are the primary cases that we investigate.
Okay. And so how does a person come to OPS? Like, if I was going to say John Smith, but that's too close with Roger Smith, but John Doe has a complaint. They feel that they have an issue with an officer. Mm-hmm. Who do they go to? How do they get to you? And what's the process from there?
Well, they can go to a number of places to make a complaint. First, they can just make the complaint via telephone. They can contact our office via telephone to make a complaint. They can also come into our office to make a complaint in person. They can file a complaint online at our webpage on the city's website. And they can also contact the Mayor's Action Center if they want to make a complaint that way. They basically could call the Mayor's Action Center, and the Mayor's Action Center would then forward us their complaint. In addition to that, they can walk into their local district police department. They keep OPS complaints there. They keep OPS complaint forms, and also police officers carry around OPS complaint forms in their vehicles so that if a person at the scene of a traffic stop, for instance, wants to make a complaint, they can receive a complaint form right there.
All right, so that's interesting. So that's something that I did not know. So, if I'm hearing you correctly, officers from the Cleveland Police Department all have these OPS forms with them. And so when they have an interaction with someone and someone says, I want to call your supervisor, or I'm going to file a complaint about you, they actually have the ability to ask that officer for an OPS form right there on the scene?
Yeah, if that officer is with a vehicle, the forms will be in the vehicle, yes.
That's interesting. And so if they take that form and they fill that out, are they giving it back to the officer? Are they mailing it in, taking it to a district like you said? I mean, how would you recommend that form then get to you, to your office?
I would not recommend giving it back to the officer for obvious reasons that, the complaint subject matter may very well involve that officer. They can turn it in at their local precinct. They can also mail it to us. They can bring it to us. Any of those ways would be acceptable if they receive a form from an officer and they would like to use it for a complaint.
Okay. All right, that's fair. So let me ask you, because you said I wouldn't give it back to the officer, so it just made me think of something. Suppose you have someone who wants to file that complaint, but they're scared. They're scared to do it because they see those same officers patrolling. What sort of protections are in place if they say, well, I want to do it, but I want to be anonymous? What sort of assurances can you give someone that when they file a complaint, there's not going to be some sort of retribution merely for filing it?
Well, we do accept anonymous complaints. and we get several every year. So that's one thing they could do. With respect to the assurances regarding retaliation, the one thing we can say is that in our experience, we take retaliation very seriously, but in our experience, we have seen that the department takes retaliation very seriously as well. And depending on the circumstances, retaliation could very well lead to criminal charges against the officers. So absolutely, retaliation is taken very seriously by everybody in the process. But for those who continue to have that concern, they could also file the complaints anonymously.
Okay, all right, perfect. Sergeant, I'm going to go back to you for a moment. We have approximately 1,600, I believe, officers in the Cleveland Police Department. Do you know how many African-American officers there are of those 1,600 approximately?
I would say there are approximately 300 African-American officers that work for the division currently.
Okay, all right. So ballpark, give or take, around 20% is
Correct.
Okay. And representing those officers in your position, I'm just going to ask you a question point blank. Do you feel that there is a racism problem within departments, police departments, in your experience? And then we'll get more in depth depending upon your answer.
That is very difficult, because I feel like there's a cultural problem, a class problem, and in my era, blatant racism, have I seen it? Maybe it's more covert, but what I do see is that respecting the community. Is there a reason why there's officers that patrol an area of, say, Pepper Pike, more of an affluent community? Why are they getting treated differently than someone that lives in an area that may be more people that live in poverty? Should they get the same services? So I do see that it's a difference of how people are treated, but because of class and maybe race. I have seen that before. It's not right, and I feel as if you're serving the police department, no matter what someone's economic class is, their sexual orientation is, they should be treated fairly. And in all situations, you don't see that. And why would someone that doesn't resemble the community, why do they want to work in the community? Why do they want to work in Cleveland? Is it because they're adrenaline junkies, or do they really want to serve? So those are questions that I think with that recruitment process, I think they're going to start asking more questions like that, because you don't want to get someone that when I go into an area like Morris Black and they say, why don't the police just patrol the area? I only see the police when they're arresting somebody. So why can't they get that same service as someone that lives in an affluent area of Cleveland? So those are questions that, is it racism? Is it class? There could be a lot of answers or variations to that.
Okay. So Sergeant, you have, obviously you've been an officer for a long time, been in law enforcement. You've been able to see firsthand some of these issues that we're discussing. When you raise these issues, or if you try to raise these issues at the department, how is it received?
Well, when people bring issues to me, I would say that if you bring facts to the department, I think it is looked at and reviewed, but it depends. It's a process, and we know it's a process. It takes time. And some people that's experiencing, when they experience a issue where because of their sexuality or their race, and they've been discriminated against, if they feel that way, they feel like that it's not handled immediately, because it has to go through the process, and they feel alone. When they see an issue on the street where they see a a citizen that might have been treated the wrong way by another person, how is it handled when that officer tells that supervisor or another officer, well, you know, are excuses made to cover up that problem? Now you see that person that they complained about, eventually they're become part of the problem on the job. Now you see that they get a lot of OPS complaints. Now you see that they get a lot of internal complaints. And now the city is paying out lawsuits on this person, but those issues were addressed initially. So we have identified some of the problems on the job, but now it's up to the community to get on people that's in politics, the policymakers, to say, why are they still working for the department?
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Roger, we've got a question from one of our viewers, and
Sure.
for you. Have any officers ever been criminally charged for any retaliation against a complaining party that you're aware of?
Well, there's actually one case that is currently in court for exactly that issue. There is an officer who was recently indicted, and this was reported upon Officer Tell. And that was a case that involved, in part, a fair amount of retaliation against a civilian who made a complaint.
Got it. Okay. All right. And this question's for both of you. Also, one of our viewers, the question is that Cleveland is nearly 50% Black, 20% officers being Black is a big representation gap. How do we deal with that? How do we change that?
Well, I think one thing is that I'm sure that I know that we've been working on recruitment, and I know we've been doing that. But when people see what's going on with policing around the world, they're like, why would I even sign up for this job? Why would I put my life on the line? Why would I do this and that? But I think part of it is trying to change the narrative, because I get it at work. I get people that say, well, you're Black, and don't you know where policing stemmed from? So why did you choose this profession? Why are you doing this? You're a sellout. Like, you get those things. But they don't talk about the career path, and that some people that's on this job, their father, their grandfather, their great grandfather was on this job, and this job is a good career. Not only are you serving the community, but that's the issue I'm having with people that terrorize the community that's in policing or complaining, because the community, they're making demands. They want change, and we're not listening to it. And that's the problem I have, because people become millionaires off this job as police officers. They make 6 figures a year for arresting people in the community and doing things. I'm not saying everything officers do is wrong, but if the community is complaining about it, the world is complaining. We need to listen and make some changes, because we're getting paid off of the taxpayers' money. So if someone has some issues like qualified immunity has been brought up, looking at the collective bargaining agreement, all these things have been looked at, and I think it needs to be reevaluated, because do officers have too much power? I think sometimes I would say yes, because if someone's bored, an officer's bored, they could find any reason to pull you over, to take you out your car. They could find any reason for probable cause, because they got an ORC, they got the Cleveland Municipal Code to back them up for why they pulled you over. They could make it up when they get to the car. They just find a reason. Hey, I smell weed in the car. I'm gonna take you out the car. I haven't seen it. Officers complain about the protests. How I heard it from the citizens part. Officers were told that you have full range. You could pepper spray, you could shoot out gas canisters, and you don't have to do a use of force at all. So you got some officers say, hey, I'm not trying to be part of that. But what about the officers that really want to do that? They could just pepper spray the community and shoot gas cans at them and all this stuff. Why would you want to do that to the community? And so those things really need to be addressed. And I think once we start changing the narrative, will there start being more officers more Black police officers? I hope so. I think it would take time, but you need more people like me, people that look like the community, to recruit those people in a community and be able to tell the real stories and why they should become police officers. And I think that would be the beginning to making that change.
Well, and I just want to thank you as we're moving forward, and we obviously have a lot of discussion yet ahead, but I do want to thank you for telling the real story. We there? All right. I do want to thank you for telling that story. We certainly do need to have this discussion. So we'll continue on with that. But Roger, I want to come back to you for a moment. And I'm going to ask you a little bit more about OPS, and then I'm going to have you comment with the sergeant as we talk about reform. First off, how many reports do you think you get a year, and how many employees make up your department?
Well, we have, I'll sort of take them in reverse. Our department at this point is 15 people. We are down at this point a general manager. Our general manager, George Coulter, went to public safety for a position there. So we're set up right now for 16 employees, but we currently have 15. Now, the complaints that we get per year, last year we received 220 complaints. The year before we received 227. Over the past 4 years, we've received between 220 and 263 complaints.
Okay. And of those complaints, how many are then, I guess what happens if you substantiate a complaint, all right? What happens with that?
Okay, so our investigation, if we sustain an allegation, there are basically 4 findings that you could have with respect to any allegation. There is sustained, there is insufficient evidence, there is unfounded, and there's exonerated. We sustain, on balance, anywhere between 15 and 18% of the allegations that come to us. When we sustain an allegation, we then recommend to the Civilian Police Review Board that they also sustain it. Generally speaking, they sustain nearly all of the allegations that we recommend they sustain. Once that happens, the case is forwarded to the police department for disciplinary proceedings. And so what that will entail on most cases is that the chief will conduct a hearing. Either the chief or a deputy chief will preside over the hearing. Out of that hearing, the chief will then make a decision as to what, if any, discipline he would impose on that charge. If the chief disagrees with the board, either on the group level of discipline or on whether any discipline is required at all, the board then has the option to appeal that decision to the Director of Public Safety.
Okay. That's great, thank you. And let me ask you, we saw the officer kneeling on the neck of George Floyd, okay? And what I want to talk about on that is we also have learned that he had, I don't know the exact number until I actually see it, but 15 to 18 prior complaints, and some of them being rather serious. In our hot talk last week, we also heard about other officers having, numbers of complaints. Now, of course, wrongful complaints are made, wrongful allegations, or those that cannot be substantiated. But how do we curb, how do we stop having officers with so many violations before something really serious happens, like in that case, a murder or assaulting people? I mean, whatever it may be, but a betrayal of the public trust. How do we stop that? Because I don't know any other job where we could rack up, 10, 15 violations. Most of us who have normal jobs, we get 1 or 2 and we're gone. So I'd like your thoughts on that.
Well, you have a couple of things to consider there that I think are important. because the number of cases tells you something, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what kinds of issues that officer is having. For example, you might have an officer who has 10 unprofessional conduct sustained allegations. And then you look at it and it's basically the officer using unprofessional language with people on a regular basis. One of the ways that we can change how these situations escalate and you see officers getting into more serious trouble is by being responsive to the information that the cases are actually providing you. The big benefit that we get as a society from having civilian oversight is that you are learning detailed and specific information about the performance of officers in the line of duty. You cannot ignore the results of that information, right? These are warning signs. These are canaries in the coal mine. And so when you see an officer that has trouble with a certain type of situation or a certain type of behavior, be responsive to that. Put him in that situation less. Consider modifying the duty that that officer performs so that they're not in the situations that are getting them in trouble. If we learn from the course of an officer's career that it's multiple situations that the officer can't handle, we got to consider, is this a person suitable to perform the job of police officer? Or are they an officer that you have to confine to some very restricted duty so that they are not able to cause the community problems with their behavior?
So, Roger,
Uh-oh. I've lost you there.
are we being responsive? All right, you there?
I'm there now, yes.
Okay, all right, I don't know what happened there. Are we being responsive to those officers that do have a number of complaints?
Well, I think that there need to be more things in place to make sure that officers don't have the opportunity to keep having problem instances in the areas where they've been shown to have difficulties before. I think that there are some measures being taken to do that, but I think absolutely there need to be more.
But Roger, can I step in real quick? Because I understand what you're saying and with OPS, and it's accountability for officers, but in some ways I think it hurts the community as well. And this is why I'm saying this, and we all have our own opinion in regards to
What
this.
hurts the community? OPS?
I'm saying it divides the community. It adds friction between the relationship between officers and the community. Because when the officer gets the complaint and he gets put up on charges, he gets disciplined, he's disciplined. He gets days off or whatnot, but we're not doing anything to rehabilitate that officer. If you're saying that he spoke to a person wrong, so what I know is days off, okay, he's losing pay, but he's going back to the community with that same mindset. He's probably even more mad. So what if he sees that person again on the street that just filed a complaint against him that gave him 10 days off? It's not helping bridge that gap between the community and the department. Something has to be done. And then are you telling that citizen that, because some citizens, when they make complaints, do they always want officers to get disciplined? Or do they say that officer needs more training? Because that's what I've seen in a lot of complaints. But that officer never gets more training to the complaint. And how is that rebuilding the community? It's just going to be a cycle of continued bad behavior.
Actually, I don't think so. I think if you disincentivize bad behavior, you do reduce the likelihood of it happening. And also, let's not forget how we got here. In that situation, this began with something that an officer did on the street that was improper. That has nothing to do with OPS. And so the way to avoid OPS cases is by not engaging in the behaviors in the first place. But I understand that, officers are not perfect and things are going to happen out there, right? To the extent there need to be training, that training needs to come from within the department, there needs to be a commitment to changing the officer's behavior on that side. And, you know, in the department's defense, there is counseling and training that occurs after some of these incidents, like the one that you mentioned. I don't think it's solely a training issue. At some point, we do have to ask officers who've been involved in problematic behaviors to go and do better. But you're right, we need to give those officers the training and the resources to be better. Absolutely, I agree with you there. But I don't agree that OPS is part of the problem, or that OPS is somehow dividing the community by doing investigations that point out these problems.
But I was just saying that it adds tension between the police. It creates a us versus them mentality. So that's what I'm saying. What do you say to that officer? How is that relationship going to be repaired when that officer and that person that filed that complaint, they never see each other again? So all we know is this person filed a complaint and this officer got 10 days off. So now when this officer sees this person again, how is that interaction going to take place?
It's the behaviors that create the tension. It's the behaviors that create the problem. Because if an officer has a complaint, it's because of something that officer did. And what's going to affect that relationship more? What the officer did or the investigation that ensues from it?
Let me pipe in and see if I can take this to the next question. And Sergeant, if I'm hearing you correctly, Roger, this question is for you. So let's say that the recommendation for an officer, the conduct was, determined it was substantiated and 10 days off. Okay. We see from the disciplinary file, the person has kind of a history of, maybe they have anger issues. So the concern would be this person is now put on 10 days leave. Are they just going back to the street with those same anger issues, or is part of the
Yes, I'm with you.
treatment also that they're going to get counseling to help them address those issues that are causing that anger issue? Because I would be more scared of the officer that I just reported who got 10 days off with no pay and then is now coming back to my street. So what is CPD doing to make sure they get to the root cause of that anger so they're not putting the angry officer back on the street?
Well, they do provide counseling. That's one of the things that comes out of cases. And also we're sort of portraying this in terms of the amount of suspension days. What you have is a group penalty structure. So there's certain conduct that would be considered group 1 conduct. And a first offense, unprofessional conduct would probably fall into group 1 under most circumstances. And group 1 penalties range from reprimand up to 5 days. And if it's a first offense, you can actually, in some circumstances, get counseling or verbal instruction instead of any kind of penalty imposed. That's for first offense. So you're only seeing those vacation days lost and those increased penalties after the first offense for something like a statement that was improper on the street.
Got it. So your office was really put into place as a result of the consent decree overseen by federal Judge Solomon Oliver. Is that correct?
Well, we weren't put into place as a result of the consent decree. We were fully civilianized as a result. We were put into place by the city charter in the 80s. Okay. And up through 2010, there were nothing but police department investigators here, and there was one civilian employee, the administrator. Beginning in 2011, in May 2011, we began to bring in civilian investigators. And in fact, the first investigator that was brought in, Investigator David Hammonds, is still with us, as is the second investigator, Anitra Merritt, who was brought in. So over time, between 2011 and the end of 2016, civilian investigators were coming in and department employees were leaving the agency until the point where at the end of 2016, the last department employees were out. And then in April 2017, the OPS manual was approved by Judge Oliver. And what that manual requires is that all OPS employees be civilians.
I see. Okay. And who do you report to? Is there another agency that oversees OPS?
Well, there's a couple of things there. First, we're a part of public safety. So my direct supervision comes from the director of public safety. Second, in addition to that, because civilian oversight has to be, in order for it to be effective, it has to be independent. The supervision that we are primarily get at this point comes through the monitoring team, the federal monitoring team overseeing the consent decree, as well as the Department of Justice. Every 2 weeks, we have a work group call with them where there is discussion of where things stand with respect to agency practices and any observations that they're making based on the data they're seeing as to things that need to be changed, and generally speaking, to ensure that the processes are done correctly.
Okay. So, Roger, I want to pick up kind of where the Sergeant and I left off, and we were talking about protests, okay? I'm not going to get into the protests necessarily, but what I do want to ask you is police reform? I mean, everyone's calling from the community for police reform, and what that means is different to every different person. So my question to you is police reform necessary? And if you can be specific from your perspective, what that means, what specifically needs to change?
Well, police reform is necessary. And I don't say that just because we're seeing such demonstrations in favor of it. I say it just based on the ordinary course of business. The work that officers do is challenging. One of the things that needs to change is that we have to take officers out of situations that they're not ideally suited to handle. One example of this is we have many categories where arrests are being made, many situations that are arrestable offenses. We have to take a look at how much of the conduct that officers can currently arrest for should they be making arrests for. And the cases that have drawn so much attention, George Floyd and Eric Garner, are two examples. Or are those the kind of situations where we want officers to be showing up and making arrests? In Eric Garner's case, it was untaxed cigarettes. Is that the kind of thing that we want officers showing up to make arrests for? Because any of those situations has the potential to turn into something serious, provided there's not compliance, and the officers then have to resort to force to make that arrest. So that's one of the things that we need to consider.
Thank you. Sergeant, same question to you. In your opinion, in your experience, whether or not reform is necessary, and if so,
Yes, police reform is necessary.
what does that look like to you?
It's been necessary, and what does it look like?
What
And what
specifically would you call for reform?
for law enforcement, it looks like accountability, and that's why. And I'm glad Roger Smith talked about OPS. Officers being held accountable and being transparent to the community. So what I see in police reform also is starting to recruit more people in the community that reflects the community. So I think that's also a start of police reform. So police reforms begin with officers not being defensive over what the community wants. When someone says something about police reform, we can't get defensive. We have to listen and accept that. And I feel like in policing, some of the biggest issues that we have is that when our authority is challenged, how do we react to it? And I think sometimes officers, they get real defensive. So if someone's cussing me out and they're walking away, they're walking away. But am I going to let it get under my skin because they're not listening to me and then have a use of force? And so that's in law enforcement, we have to learn to be accountable and own it when we messed up. I don't have to defend what happened to George Floyd. I could say that officer committed a crime. And I'm in law enforcement, and I got to be able to stand up and do that. And so once we get more people in law enforcement able to accept being accountable, and really listening to what the community wants, I think reform will happen. But we can't ignore those issues. When someone says racism or he treated me this way because of my color of my skin, we can't ignore that. That could be legitimate. But I feel like those things have been ignored for years.
Still an issue that needs a solution.
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, you're saying they need to listen, and we need someone to make a claim. At least need to listen.
Ian, I'm going to interrupt. You've got
Yes.
some very bad distortion in your audio.
I apologize. Brennan, do you have a question? I'm sorry.
I did not hear I can't hear your question. Your audio is very badly distorted. I would suggest muting yourself and then unmuting. Try that.
Brennan, why don't you take the questions then for a moment, and I apologize.
Okay, well, I will ask a question, and I believe this should go to Roger. One of the participants says, when citizens make complaints, is the officer's body cam automatically reviewed as evidence?
Yes, it is. Yeah, in the ordinary course of business, we request officers' body cameras, and we do review them. And WCS violations or wearable camera system violations are a regular part of basically our investigative diet.
But and then to piggyback off of that, and some issues that I've had from people in the community with the body cameras, when someone files a complaint and it's not immediately followed up on, sometimes that camera footage is not being used because it deletes after a certain period of time. And I'm talking about for the older complaints. And it's unfair to the community because we don't really see what really happened during that incident. Now it's the officer's word versus their word.
Ian, you're better.
Yep. Is this better now?
Much better.
It is.
Yes.
Okay. All right. The new dog's running behind us, little children running before us, grabbing our equipment, or our equipment goes off. So I apologize, gentlemen. All right.
Did you just blame your problems on children? Is that what just happened right there?
I'm gonna blame it on everybody else but me. So my child's 2. He can't defend himself yet, so it was all his fault. But all right. So Roger, how is your office perceived by the rank and file? You know, sometimes I hear internal affairs departments are not looked upon too highly by the other officers. Do you guys suffer from that?
Absolutely, and I would say we suffer from an added wrinkle to that. We're not police. At least internal affairs are part of the police department. So whatever positive benefit we would get in perception from being police, we don't even get that, right? So all we do is investigate misconduct. And yes, there's a fair amount of scorn and contempt that comes with that.
Okay. Now, the 3 of us had talked in anticipation of this discussion, and I had brought up the issue of kind of the blue wall of silence that we hear about. If you could, one of you, just kind of let our audience know what that is, and then is it real? If so, how real?
I could start. The blue wall of silence is basically the unwillingness and or failure of officers to testify regarding misconduct by other officers that they observe. And to the question as to whether it's real, I say yes, but here's how I say that. I think the blue wall of silence ends up being, in the case of investigations, an individual question. What will each officer do when they're faced with a question regarding another officer's actions that they saw or heard? Each individual officer makes a decision whether or not to report what they saw or heard. And we do get some officers who report what they saw, report what they heard, but we get a fair amount of officers not reporting things that they saw or heard, even though we can show circumstantially or by, wearable camera footage, for instance, that they did see or hear something. So absolutely, the blue wall of silence is real. How it comes into being on the other side amongst the officers, that's something I would let the sergeant to speak to.
Okay, Sergeant?
Well, in policing, I've never used that term or articulated it in that way, but I do see that culturally in the department there is silence when it comes to things, and like I mentioned, sometimes you want to fit in with that culture, and sometimes you going home at night depends on you fitting in with that culture. It's definitely not right, and I think the culture needs to change, and that's why me as the Black Shield president, I'm speaking out, because a lot of times when you see officers talk to the public, they don't look like me, and you don't hear enough of Black officers talking in regards to their experiences on the police department, and from what Roger Smith was saying, many officers do speak out. They may not, because when officers talk, they're not going to OPS when they're talking about actions, misconduct. They're going to the inspection unit and internal affairs. And I would say that they do speak out, but they are afraid though. If they do speak out, they might be retaliated against, and it's a good chance that that may happen. And how to strengthen that relationship with OPS, I don't know, because I'm in the hearings with OPS and officers, and they're almost like, I feel like if they were in a ring, they would throw punches at each other. That's how intense it is with that. But officers, when they see things, there are a lot of complaints made on other officers for misconduct. It does happen internally, and I think that more officers speak out than what we would even know. It's just not broadcast. But I think that culture needs to come out more when you're talking about excessive force, because how do you get in trouble? If I see an officer doing something wrong and I'm part of that culture, will I stand up at that particular time? Or once the investigation come out, I'm called in and I'm forced to speak out and testify, will that happen? And that takes courage, and that's part of the culture change, that once it happens, I think that you're going to see more officers standing out immediately. So it won't be any more George Floyds when they're watching. They're going to pull that officer off of them and say, this is wrong.
Can we, some might say it sounds ambitious and idealistic and so forth. Do you guys have hope that we will get past where we are today so that we don't have more unjustified killings? I mean, we just saw what happened in Atlanta, and I'm not here to talk about a particular case, but do you have hope that we're moving in the right direction and that one day we'll be able to look on this as a bad chapter in history?
I do, absolutely. I think that what's happening right now is important because we're setting the stage right now for the real conversation that needs to happen. Because much of the previous conversation has been about generalizations and essentially about people's general thoughts about policing, about police, and about the public. I think now the amount of demonstration that we've seen and the reaction in the aftermath of Floyd has set the stage for a specific conversation about specific things that need to happen to make for improvements. And many of the things being discussed, I think, will create lasting improvement as long as the discussion is not dropped. That's what I consider to be the most important thing right now, is that this specific discussion that has begun, that it's not dropped before it has a chance to produce meaningful change.
That's exactly what I'm thinking. That's my biggest fear, and that's exactly why the CMBA has been committed to having these talks weekly, so that the discussions don't stop, that we don't take a step backwards until laws are put into place, cultures are changed, and trust is rebuilt. So I'm glad to hear you say that. Sergeant, what do you have to say to Mr. Smith's thought on that? Do you have hope, or where do you stand on this?
Yes, I am hopeful that the system itself will change. We have come so far, and I think that just talking about, and this is me just being a Black man, the times when I complained about racism and being treated unfair, I feel like I was being ignored. Now I feel like the world is listening to the systemic issue that's been going on in this country for years. And now when a Black person says that they've been treated differently because of their race, I feel like people are listening. So I feel like this is the time right now to let your voice be heard. And within the department now, I feel like they're going to listen to seriously when we make a complaint in regards to being treated differently because of who we are or how we look. Because just being a Black man, there has been a hopelessness. I've been told that I couldn't do something because of the color of my skin. And I had to work harder to accomplish certain things. And so now I think police officers, it don't matter if you're Black or white, you're going to be forced to respect the community you serve, no matter what. And I think changes are going to be made, and they got to take away this us versus them mentality. If we're not going to be a part of the change, you might as well retire, because you're going to be forced to be part of this change. And it's going to happen. It's happening now. And it starts with having a conversation like we're having today.
That's great. Roger, your process at OPS, is that open to the public? So let's say people are aware of a situation. Are they able to come and see those hearings? If not, what is public?
Yes, when a case gets to the Civilian Police Review Board for review, the public can go to those meetings. Those meetings are open to the public. Right now, we're in the process of having a series of virtual board meetings, and those are available for public access as well.
Okay. All right. Now, it's, we've been talking about what's wrong and what needs to be fixed, but in all fairness, I'd like to both give you the opportunity to talk about what's right and what, the community should know as well. So I put that to both of you. What is it that's been working that you don't think people know and should know?
Well, I want to do something. When I first got here in 2018, I was shocked that lack of service was an allegation that OPS had jurisdiction over. And in one of my first meetings with the department, I commended them for that, because I think, to the extent that they have demonstrated a willingness to take that on as an allegation, I think it speaks to at least a measure of good faith with respect to giving the public a way to create better police service for them. So that's one thing I would definitely say is an enormous positive.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Sergeant?
Yeah, and a lot of positive things to take away from this is that even though that there are things that in policing that needs to change and that reform needs to be made, there are a lot of police officers that do put their lives on the line every day. And I could attest to that, because I've been shot at before for finding stolen cars, just shot at. There's officers that's out right now on restricted duty right now, or out because they've been, one officer was shot in the leg. So officers do take it seriously to serve the community. And that's why sometimes they get real defensive when people talk about policing, because of some of the things they go through, and they know that it's people in the community that love the police. They want us in there. They don't because they need, the police and the community, we need to work together. And so are there good things? I see officers out in the community more now, but we need more officers to patrol the areas because they're not enough. But I do see officers being held more accountable now. And I don't know if Roger Smith see the discipline notice. There are a lot of officers being disciplined now for things that they've done. So I think the culture is slowly changing, and you're seeing more people retiring because of that culture change. So I would say in the next 20 years, I'm hopeful that the community will see the change that they want and that's needed.
Okay, appreciate it. So I've got some final questions here as we go into our last couple of moments. So let me throw some of those at you, and then I'll give you each a moment or two to, say anything that you'd like our viewers to know. One of the questions that's come up through a number of times here is the wearing of the body cameras. And we heard our speaker last week talk about how that is mandated here in Cleveland. But we see that that's not always adhered to. How often, Roger, do you see that as a basis for a complaint, someone not wearing cameras? And what happens? How do you guys look at that if it's either not worn or the video is destroyed? How do you deal with that?
Well, failure to activate your wearable camera system is a charge that we see in a fair number of cases. Very often, one of the things that we need to establish was whether the circumstances under which it occurred were deliberate or not. Because sometimes you get situations where officers actually thought that they pressed the button to activate the camera and, found out later that there was no footage of a certain amount of time. And we've had situations where an incident lasted for an hour and 40 minutes are captured because the officer was fully engaged in the incident and didn't realize they hadn't put their camera on and then activated it at the 20-minute mark. So we do get some cases like that. Generally speaking, when we can show that it's deliberate or when we can show that it was a product of neglect, there is discipline for it. Officer, for a second offense, an officer will be suspended for a day as a result.
And what Roger was saying is that, and that's where I'm big at on heavy discipline, but we found that there were a lot of disciplines this year for officers not activating their cameras, but we're disciplining them. But when we go to in-service, are they being trained to make that muscle memory? They're not. People think it's easy that they just turn the camera on, but when you're in those extreme difficult situations, especially, I'm just using a situation where someone's shooting at you and you get there, you forget to turn your camera or you thought you turned it on, it's different. So when you practice that, those using the camera under extreme circumstances, I think it will help the community and it will help those officers. But we're just saying, oh, we found that person not wearing a camera and we're disciplining them. But how are we correcting those actions? And we're not doing anything. This discipline is not going to correct the action. They actually put them through a scenario where they're using those cameras so they could use it and perform better. Because it's usually having those cameras on helps the community and it helps the officer. And that's what we're not doing.
Right. So last question for me. How do you think officers, and I know everyone's different and you can't paint with a broad brush, but we hear proposals for legislative action to demilitarize, to get rid of qualified immunity, to ensure that disciplinary records go on to new jobs. What's the kind of feedback or the chatter that you're hearing amongst officers? Is this the sort of reform that they want, or do they say we don't need that? And when I say they, I'm talking in general.
I'll leave that for you, Vince.
I can't hear.
Okay, Vince, can you hear me? All right, so he may have a little bit of difficulty here. Roger, if you have a moment while he's getting back with, just on a closing comment that you'd like folks to know.
Well, the one thing I want people to know is that OPS and its investigations are fact-driven. The process that we have, the process that the board has, is designed to respond to facts. And independent civilian oversight in this city and in every city across the country is vital, because you need ways to get to the facts apart from what might happen through wearable camera systems. They don't give you the whole story. You always need to have a way for the public to understand what's happening with its police force and be responsive to what they're seeing.
Thank you, Roger. Sergeant, my question was, for those that are suggesting legislative action, whether it's demilitarizing or getting rid of qualified immunity, all those things, how is that being received by the officers in the departments? Are they looking at it as it's needed, or people just don't understand?
Well, I think people don't understand. They only understand from rhetoric. And so that's causing a division. And that's where like some of the racial divide come, because we all have different opinions depending on where you came from and your background. And so for me, I think that those conversations will help with police reform. And I know it's not a popular decision, and as far as law enforcement, I know they're not going to like it, but I think those things need to be looked at. Like qualified immunity, does officers have too much power? Looking at the collective bargaining agreements, looking at different things, defunding the police, those things definitely needs to be looked at. And I know that officers not going to like it, but we need to be held accountable, and we can't just go rogue and treat the community like they're nothing. And if these things are going to stop officers from terrorizing the community or using excessive force or just overusing their power, because officers have a lot of power, and you're telling a person that can have a high school diploma that just go out there, you can make $100,000 a year, and we'll back you from terrorizing the community. They're going to take that job and do it. That's a lot of power to give someone. Some guys that start the job at 23 years old with a high school diploma, and they got all this power. That's a lot. And I think that we have to minimize that power if the community feels like they're being violated. And this is happening over and over for years. So something extreme, something radical needs to happen for there to be change.
Okay. And Sergeant, I'll give you the closing word. Anything that you'd like to share that you think folks, on this side of the camera need to know?
Well, I just think that police officers, me personally, I'm serious about police change because I have 2 kids. I have 2 African-American boys that's 8 and 5. So I'm going to speak out, and I'm serious about police change. And so whatever I have to do, even if it's going against that code of blue or the silence of blue, even if I have to go against that and it jeopardizes my safety at work, it's worth it if the outcome is that it changes the community and it saves someone's from civil rights from being violated, or someone from dying unjustly by the hands of the police. If this conversation is going to help that change to be made, then it's worth it.
Well, listen, I can't say in words just how much I appreciate you both being with us. I agree with you. These conversations are necessary. You 2 gentlemen are honorable. I appreciate you being here. This conversation could go for days. So I'm sure that we'll be talking again. And on behalf of the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association and all those who are watching, and frankly, the community that you just helped by coming forward to engage in this dialogue, I say thank you. And I wish you both well, and I look forward to doing this again with you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. All right. And to all of you at home, thank you for joining us today. Next Tuesday, or a week from today, same time, we are going to have some of our legislators from Ohio come and talk with us about some of the proposed legislation that is out there in response to Roger and the sergeant's kind of follow-up to what they were saying here today. So This has been a great series. Again, Roger, Sergeant, thank you so much. I wish you all well at home and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.